Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's SwineNet podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. James 𝗄𝗶𝗹. How are you doing today?
Really good, Laura. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on today. Maybe before we jump into the topic at hand, let's just have you do a brief introduction about yourself.
Okay, I'd be happy to. My name is James 𝗄𝗶𝗹. I'm a veterinarian. I live in West Michigan. I went to undergrad and veterinary school at Michigan State. Graduated in 1987. Went to a mixed animal practice for 2 years in Southwest Michigan. There was a lot of outside swine in that practice, but it was also an equine referral practice. So I did enough equine to know that wasn't my desire. So I left that practice and went down and was with the late Dr. 𝗪𝗵𝘁 for 5 years in Frankfort, Indiana, central Indiana. And then I came back to Michigan in the area I grew up in 1993 and started my own practice, just a solo single person practice. I worked with a lot of people I knew from the swine industry when I was growing up, so I knew a lot about them. What that allowed me to do over the years is having long-term relationships with these guys, 2 and 3, sometimes 4 generations I knew and worked with on the farm. So it was really satisfying here in West Michigan to do that. I know Michigan is not a huge swine state, but there are counties where there's a lot of swine, and we do a pretty good job here in the state. I was in that practice for 27 years and then just sold it at the end of 2020. So semi-retired, but I have a contract finishing barn, a 4,000 head contract finishing barn that is actually on the farm I grew up on. I go up to that farm 2 or 3 times a week, not because I have to. I have good employees there, but I tell people when I was a teenager, I couldn't get away from the farm fast enough, and now I go back there for my mental therapy. So that's what I spend most of my time with. I do a little independent consulting work with Neogen, specifically on water quality. So between that gig and my contract finishing barn, I still stay fairly busy.
Absolutely. Your full-time employment has just shifted to something a little different, but that's good to hear that you're still involved in the swine industry in various aspects for sure. One of the things, James, that um, recently you had presented at ASV, and I thought this was an interesting topic. And so this was something I'd like to visit with you about today is really this concept of lifelong learning. And certainly as professionals in the industry, whether you're a DVM or a PhD, we believe in lifelong learning. We know that's part of our process, but lifelong learning goes beyond that. And so let's talk a little bit about your perception of lifelong learning and what we should be thinking about.
Well, the topic of the lecture, or the lecture title, was the 𝗪𝗲𝗿 lecture. 𝗪𝗲𝗿 was a veterinarian from Iowa. I went to vet school at Kansas State following World War II, and he was a great example of a lifelong learner. He practiced for 20 years, then he went back to Iowa State, got his master's degree at age 52. Then he was maybe most people know him for being the extension swine veterinarian at University of Nebraska for 20 years, from about 72 to 1992. And then he retired. I retired once from practice, and then retired the second time from extension. And then he went to work as a tech service veterinarian for MVP Laboratories. And that was his third career. And he finally retired from that around 2005. But his theme all the way through all of his careers was teaching people. He was a great extension specialist. He loved giving extension meetings. He loved teaching producers. He loved teaching and learning from other veterinarians. And I got to know Alex. We were in a certificate series together at University of Illinois called Executive Veterinary Program, and that was in the 90s. So he graduated from that program in 1995 at age 75 with yet another certificate to hang on his wall. So he, even into his 70s, he was still adamant about learning all he could and learning more about the industry.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. I've heard that of Dr. Hogg as well, and he's certainly well known for that. What do you think is the key to that lifelong learning? I think we all definitely want to do it. I'd say most of the time we would probably argue that we don't have enough time to maybe engage in learning or participating in a program or certification process. What do you say to that?
Well, and that's true. I got a master's degree when my kids were really young, so I could attend the classes, and a lot of it wasn't online yet, but a lot of homework for that. And when my kids were little, I was able to read and do my research in the morning before they got up. If your kids are elementary school, middle school, high school, it is very difficult to carve out time to worry about a certificate series or an advanced degree. So to me, it's you have to do it kind of before you have kids or after your kids have left the nest, so to speak. And there are oodles and oodles of opportunities for master's degree, and especially online now, many degrees you can get online. It doesn't have to be veterinary degrees. A lot of certificate series are available, and even um, you know, when you're driving down the road, the Swine It podcasts are a great way to learn just um, little tidbits. And my philosophy over the years when I go to meetings is I don't plan to learn 1,000 things that I'm going to go home and implement. But if I sit in a lecture and I can learn one or two take home things, then that's a success. I don't need to have 20 things after a lecture. And I think if you go into it and try to pick out one or two key things in a lecture, that will help you. And the other thing is that I insist on when I'm planning lecture on program committees is that there are bona fide take-home messages. We can talk about research trials and da 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 and come to a conclusion, but a lot of times there's not anything we can take home and start using in the barn the next day. So take-home messages on any kind of continuing education are really important to me.
Mm-hmm. And I think you hit the nail on the head too. You mentioned that we don't have to always be doing online degrees or certifications. It can be something as simple as a podcast or reading an article for the day, something maybe you could do over a cup of coffee in the morning or as you're wrapping up for the evening. Is that a fair thought?
Yeah, and I would like to say that one of the smartest producers I worked with over the years, um, he read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times from cover to cover every day. He had that in his plans. He got up, he had his coffee, and he read, and he was so smart and worldly. Um, he was a great farmer too, but he knew a lot about other topics and how to get along in life and maybe politics. But just a smart guy to sit down and talk to.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things I heard you say at the first little section there was really about taking something back to the barns, having that take home message. And I think that's something that I hear too is, well, how do you define learning? Is learning you understanding a new piece of information that you didn't know before, or is learning taking that information and applying it in the barns or in practice? So how do you view the concept of learning?
Well, even really complex research trials and studies, ultimately they have a conclusion, and you might not be able to use that right away, but maybe 2 years down the road, that'll come into play with a new vaccine or a new treatment protocol or something like that. So as you get older, it's harder to retain stuff, but everything is so accessible now with smartphones and stuff that you don't have to remember that on the tip of your tongue. But if you take notes and put them in your phone or put them on your laptop, at least you can refer back to them and have them available.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a whole stack of notebooks from various years of meetings and so forth. And I think for me, the hardest thing is just keeping it organized. I've seen people now today put it on their phones and have the ability to do keyword searches and so forth to keep it a little bit more organized. But I would say that's probably one of the challenges I have going to meetings is I write things on paper and then I lose the paper, or I just don't have a very good filing system. Any suggestions on how to take those notes and put them into play?
Yeah, just one funny story, quick. When I sold my practice, I had this literally closet full of meeting notes, summaries of meetings, even the 𝗪𝗶𝗹𝗹 journal. All of those from day one I had, and I just took them to the recycle center, and it was kind of a bittersweet moment that I've had collected those things over 30 years of practice, but everything's online now, so you don't need a hard copy.
Mhm.
And specifically to your question, what I do personally is I get a new notebook, a spiral notebook or a binder, and for every year. So 2022, I have a binder that I keep notes from meetings in, and I get a new one even if it's not full for the following year. So at least it's organized by year, and I have those on my shelf. And if I can kind of get an idea, say, boy, it seems like a couple years ago I was at a meeting and wrote this down, at least I can go back to that notebook and say, oh yeah, here it is, and from 2020, this is what I was looking for.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I like that one. Any other tips or tricks you would suggest to the listeners today on being a lifelong learner?
Just there are so many things, both on a producer level and a veterinarian level, that some aren't going to be for you, but others, I enjoy listening to as I drive. It's hard for me to sit at my desk and listen. I just can't sit still. But when I drive, I have a catalog or a folder that I keep those in, and when I'm driving more than 15 or 20 minutes, I'll pop one on and listen to it. And so keeping them organized, easily accessible on your smartphone, put them in a file, and you'll get to them when you get to them. But don't waste your time listening to something you don't really enjoy or don't think you're going to really ever use.
Hmm. Yeah, and I liked your tip earlier too. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to your career or your profession. And so you mentioned the farmer that always read the Wall Street. I think that's actually really good from that perspective. So, any tips or tricks on finding some good resources, maybe outside of swine, that you think would be of value to our audience?
Well, I would suggest that you get for news, for instance, listen to more than one source. Maybe listen to BBC so you get an idea of what's going on in Europe. They have an ag section, so listen to what's going on in the UK. Um, Animal welfare, nutritional things, antibiotics. Usually, what happens in the UK is going to happen here in 5 or 10 years, so it might prepare you. So Reuters news service, a great independent news service. BBC. There's others, but I just really beg people to listen to more than one news source so they're able to get more than one narrow perspective.
Hmm. One of the things I started doing recently too was just pulling up opinion pages or opinion sections and reading some of those. And I know that seems kind of odd because it's not really true education, but for me, it kept the pulse on what's happening, what's people's mindset. And if you read one on antibiotics or you read one on, um, agriculture in general, it at least helped me kind of get a pulse for what either information is going out to the rest of the public or kind of where those trends are headed.
I know a lot of veterinarians that I deal with when they're on any kind of a trip or a foreign trip. If they go to a supermarket, they go right to the meat case and say, what's available here and what are we looking at? And to understand what other people, what other cultures are doing, really can either focus or open your mind. Oh yeah, I guess there is a use for this. So it's just valuable to learn what other people are doing.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I can imagine a few of our listeners might be thinking is, well, my gosh, there's information overload all day long. I'm bombarded by information. And so, how do I make time? Why do I make time for this? And how do I prevent that feeling of just having one more thing to read, one more thing to do? Do you have any suggestions for that?
I would say just be organized and know what you want to listen to or read, and keep that organized. Kind of file it, but you literally can't read everything there is to read. So as you get older, as your kids age, your interests change on what you think you need to read. The political landscape, sometimes that's tiring to read about. One of the things I do occasionally on the podcast I listen to is just find a comedy thing or something that's just way off the mark, fiction book or a comedy series or something like that, just so you can get a chuckle and it changes your perspective and rests your mind, and then you're ready to get back to the scientific stuff when you need to later on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a really good tip. I like that one. Anything else you'd like to share? I know you mentioned Dr. Hogg and some of his passion for lifelong learning. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the group today?
Well, there was a section in that lecture that I entitled "What We Have to Learn Yet as an Industry." Interesting. One of the things I donated to the AASV auction was a 1891 Iowa Agricultural Yearbook, and I was reading in the swine section, and it literally said, "We've pretty much perfected the pig. All we need to do is maintain it now. We don't need to get any leaner or any faster growing. We just need to maintain what we have." And man, was that not accurate. So the question, do we have a perfect pig? No, we don't. We need, there are some things we need to learn about the pig, and specifically, as a contract finisher, I'll have a batch that will have horrible tail biting. And is it genetics? Is it nutrition? Is it density? Is it air quality? Everybody points their fingers in a different direction on really what causes that. But it's a horrible vice, very expensive vice, because those pigs, if they die, they're 200 pounds plus when they die, very expensive. You've got a lot of money in them. So we don't have a good answer on some of those vices, ear necrosis, tail biting, side biting. We really don't know what causes that. We'll try to change this or try to change that to get on top of it, but it's a horrible vice, and trying to explain that to lay people. I'm surrounded where my contract finisher is by fruit farmers, and they're smart guys. They grow apples, they grow cherries, they grow peaches, and a lot of them have a few cattle, but none of them have pigs. But so they understand agriculture pretty much. And the finisher mortality, when I have an outbreak of tail biting, they just don't understand, why are you losing so many pigs? And I said, well, we have this tail biting problem, and it's hard to explain even to other agricultural people why we have tail biting, why we have 5, 6, 7% mortality in finishers, it's hard to explain to other agricultural people, let alone lay people, why we lose 200 pigs out of 4,000. It just kind of, and they ask me, well, why are you losing pigs? And I scratch my head and say, how can I explain this? So some of the vices we need to learn more about. I think there's a fair amount of low-grade respiratory diseases that we kind of sweep under the rug. We may treat them. If you see in your contract finisher, after you've sold 80% of the pigs, if you see a lot of eye discharge and stuff on the pigs that are left, chances are you've got some upper respiratory things, some parasuis, some strep suis, some mycoplasma hyorinus. And we as an industry really don't understand what the implications are to that and really what the root cause. When you do diagnostics, you'll find all three of those organisms and maybe others. How important is one versus the other? And how do we treat those? Do we treat every single pig, or do we treat pigs that are just showing signs? And one of the comments I made during the hog lecture was, a lot of those pigs, if you cut their snouts, they have turbinate atrophy, like the old atrophic rhinitis. And most people have gone away from doing slaughter checks and scoring snouts. I honestly believe we need to get back to that. I think people would be surprised on how much turbinate atrophy are on some of those tail end pigs. And we test them, they're negative for Pasteurella type D. But what's causing that? There is turbinate atrophy. We don't see twisted snouts, but we do see growth stunting and slow growth on those pigs. So I think the industry, we need to figure out, first of all, what that is, and second of all, what to do about it. Water quality, I mentioned earlier about working for Neogen and water quality. The pig people are definitely behind the poultry people. In my time at Neogen, we spend most of our time at poultry farms, broilers, layers, turkeys, putting water systems in. And the systems we're putting in are very similar to municipal water treatment. So it's chlorinated to get rid of the bacteria. And I think some of these large sow units, large finisher units, they really need to get a handle on their water quality. About 20% of the nurseries we do water testing on, we find out there's E. coli in the water lines. And if you're struggling in the nursery with E. coli scours, if you're actually feeding the pigs E. coli in the water, why wouldn't they have scours? So the pig industry has a lot of space to make up as far as good water quality. So I'll leave it at that. And I did talk to Marcio one time. He put a thing out about sow productivity and how do we do better with sow productivity, and with today's labor market, what are we going to do when we can't find people to do split suckling and cross fostering and all this? And I wrote back to him and I said, we just need a better sow. And I've kind of thought this over the years that, we buy these sows or replacement gilts from the various genetic companies, and I think the average parity is 3.5 when they go out the door. To me, as much as you're paying for those replacement gilts, you should get more than 3.5 litters out of them. And of course, that's not in the breeding company's best interest because they wouldn't sell as many gilts. But why the industry puts up with any kind of genetics that you only get 3 or 3.5 parity out of just blows my mind. Why they're not demanding more. So I'll just leave it at that. Just some things we need to learn as the industry to help us be better stewards of the swine world.
Mm-hmm. I think those are all good topics to think about, and certainly ones to challenge ourselves with. And, I can even think in the last few years with with COVID and obviously now with feed ingredient prices, it's always interesting to hear the conversations from a nutritionist perspective. And the reality of it is some of the work that we're asking about now might have been done, of course, back in the 80s or 90s, and some of it may still be relevant, some of it may not, based on the genetics and the type of pig we're dealing with today relative to back then. But again, that's part of that lifelong learning, is going back and reviewing what's already been done and taking that information and going a step further. And so I think a lot of what you suggested, we have some really good foundation pieces there. We just need to keep stepping it further and challenging ourselves.
One thing I tell people is that on the market pigs, we've kind of created a really fast race car, an animal that eats a lot, grows fast, very efficient, very fine-tuned machine. But I'm not convinced we really know how to manage that animal as well as we could. I think there's room for improvement. We have to just learn more about how to manage that animal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree there for sure. Well, as we wrap up our time, James, would you mind just giving a couple of key points to our audience so that they have some takeaways from today's conversation?
Yeah, just lifelong learning. The best clients I worked with had me out and asked me what I thought, and were trying to learn from me, and I was trying to learn from them. As opposed to other clients, you kind of wonder why you're there, because they seem to know everything already, and anything you say is not going to change. They're just like, yeah, whatever. But the better clients are the ones who know they don't know everything and are information sponges. They just want to learn how to do a better job. So those are fun clients to work with. You really have to massage the know-it-alls to get anything done in those situations, but just keep trying.
Absolutely. That's a good key point for our audience to take away from today's discussion. Well, as we wrap up our time, there are a couple of questions that we like to ask all of our speakers. And I know it sounded like maybe I asked them earlier, but I'm going to ask them in a more formal way this time. Do you have a swine resource that you would recommend to our audience?
Yeah, just on the production side, I like the 𝗪𝗁, 𝗪𝗁.com. It's very good, thorough, a lot of information there. There's also a poultry site and a cattle site if you're branching out. But the pig site for production stuff, still I go back to diseases of swine on the veterinary side on a regular basis. So that's pretty hard to beat, diseases of swine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. How about something that's not pig related? Do you have any references or resources you'd recommend tonight?
Yeah, so I just read a book called The Code Breaker, and it's the story of Dr. 𝗪𝗶𝗿𝗹 as she developed the CRISPR technology to do gene editing. And it was fascinating, just the gene editing part, but all of the politics she had to go through to get that patented, and now it's much more refined than just the CRISPR technology. But it was a really fascinating book that I would recommend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like a good book. The last question I have really goes back to, if you can think of somebody in your lifetime that you've defined as successful, what would be a key characteristic about them that you think has allowed them to be successful?
Well, there's two people that I'd like to bring up, and one, of course, is Alex Hogg. He was a gem of a guy, just a nice guy, wanted to work and wanted to make everybody better. And that was his lifelong goal, is just to make everybody better. And the second person is one of my strongest mentors as I was early in practice, and that was Max 𝗪𝗪𝗿. as you may have heard, he passed away just a couple of weeks ago, and it's it was very hard on me. It was very hard on his family. Hated to see that happen to Max, but just the nicest guy you ever want to see in practice, out of practice. I don't think Max had a mean bone in his body, and I just would emulate, if I could be just as nice and as pleasant as Max was, then that would be success for me.
Mm-hmm. Those are two great traits. I greatly appreciate you bringing up Dr. 𝗪𝗏 as well. Well, James, our time is really wrapped up for us tonight. I greatly appreciate your conversation with me. Again, we want to thank you for your time tonight.
Very good. Thanks for having me, Laura. I appreciate it.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.